Okay, we're now going to take a look at a different kind of evidence for phonological constraints. And this is also from German, where we looked at the German pattern earlier and saw that German, in the general case, has voicing contrast. That is, it has them before sonorant consonants and before vowels. But word finally, we saw only voiceless obstruents in German. And what we're seeing here is a list of related forms of the same morpheme. In particular, in the left column here are singular nouns, and in the right column are plural nouns. These are plurals that all happen to take the same plural affix in German. There's actually several different plural affixes in German, but these ones all have the same one. And the question is going to be, what's going on with these forms in German? And this is getting into our next topic, which is going to be about phonological alternations or morphological alternations. This is where a single morpheme takes on different phonological forms depending on where it occurs. The first thing to notice here is that these two columns are not equal because, in particular, one of them has more morphemes than the other. Right? And in principle, it would be possible for a language to have no morpheme for the singular and a morpheme for the plural, or no morpheme for the plural and a morpheme only for the singular, or to have morphemes for both of them. And so the first question is, what's the morphological structure of these words? And we can start with the first one, peep, and that means peep. And if there's more than one, it's peepa. So it looks like we're adding something to make the plural. And in particular, in this form, you could say probably the plural is this suffix at the end of the word, schwa. Does that work for the next one? Well, this is the word word. It's Wort. And if you look over here, Worte is the plural. So words. So yes, it does look like the suffix schwa is the plural here. So the first step we need to do is figure out the morphological structure and then separate the morphs, the surface variants of the morphemes in the morphologically complex ones. This would be peep followed by this would be Wort followed by So we can break down the complex forms into their morphs. For instance, I'm going to use a normal E here because I don't think I can use IPA in this PDF annotation. So imagine this is a schwa, even though I've written it as an E. This is how we would segment this particular form. It's the morph for word, Wort, and then the morph for plural, right, which is a schwa. I've written it as an E. And we can do this for all of these. They're going to all be the same, so not that interesting. It's going to be everything but the schwa is the morph associated with the stem, with the noun, whereas the schwa is going to be associated with the plural. Right? And so far, there's nothing interesting happening. We have the noun peep. We add a schwa to it, we get peepa, nothing changes. We have the noun Wort, we add the schwa to it, nothing changes, Worte. Same for these ones, these ones, these ones. We keep going. Now something interesting is happening. For this one, deep, if you add the plural, you should get deepa, just like peepa. That's not what happens. Instead, here we find diba with a voiced stop. Similarly here, lop is not, the plural is not lopa, it's loba. Here's mort, and the plural is not morta, it's molda. So here, all of a sudden, we're finding that the voicing of these stops is changing when you put them in the plural. In other words, these have two different morphs. How would we write that out? Well, we would say that, well, this one has only the morph Wort, for instance. This one, praise, seems to have two different ones. There's, first of all, Lob, but then also we find Lob. Now, that second one is not the full word form. It's just the form of the morpheme for praise that pops up in this context with a plural. So we have some words that only have one surface morph or surface variant, like vort, and other words like loop that have two different ones. Oops. So as phonologists, it's our job to figure out what's going on here. So take a moment and see if you can figure out what's happening with these singular and plural pairs. What's the difference between the first set of words here that don't alternate? This is called alternating when you have more than one surface form. And this second set of words that do alternate. What do you think the difference is between them? Well, here's an observation. If you list all of the morphemes that show more than one surface variant, like loop, first of all, we call those surface variants allomorphs, right? By analogy to allophones, we say that the morpheme for praise, whatever its real form is, has two allomorphs, lop and lob. Whereas this one for word has only one allomorph, or I guess you could call it no allomorphs. It only has the single form vort. Right? So if you list all the ones that don't alternate, like vort, and all the ones that do alternate, like lob, you'll find that all of these ones have a voiced stop when they're followed by a schwa, but a voiceless stop when they're at the end of a word. While all of the non-alternating ones have voiceless stops at the end of the word, just like these, and voiceless stops when they're before a schwa, unlike these. So the first thing to note here is that we have asymmetric information in these two contexts, the singular context and the plural context. In particular, we have only voiceless stops in the singular context at the ends of these morphemes, but in the plural context, where there's a following vowel, we have both voiceless and voiced stops. So in order to figure out what's going on in terms of contrast, we're going to need to look at the more informative context. Because there are more possible sounds that can appear in this one, it has more information than this one. So this is one of the first principles of morpho-phonological alternations. To find representations, you need to look at the more informative context. And in particular, it's very hard to see how you could get a contrast like moda versus volta, right, where this voiceless coronal stop and this voiced coronal stop are in exactly the same surrounding context if this voicing feature weren't contrastive. Right? This is unpredictable phonologically, therefore it must be a contrastive feature. But in order for that to work, if you look at these allomorphs here, all right, let me fix this. What you'd have to say is that it's actually the final consonant in these stems that contrasts, where this must end in a voiced stop because it's unpredictably voiced in this context, while this one must end in a voiceless stop because it's unpredictably voiceless in this context. And what that means is that if these are underlyingly voiced final obstruents in each of these nouns, and they're showing up in their true underlying form here, something must be happening over here, where they're no longer voiced but voiceless, and all of a sudden we've lost the contrast. Now this should look a little bit familiar, because we saw earlier that German has a voicing contrast, but it neutralizes at the end of a word. What these alternations are showing us is that this is a productive aspect of German phonological grammar that doesn't rely on loan words or novel words or anything like that. You can see this in native German vocabulary by taking a single morpheme, which has a single underlying form in the lexicon, and putting it in different phonological contexts. So each of these nouns must be memorized in the lexicon with underlyingly voiced or voiceless consonants, for instance, mod or vot, and I'm putting these in slashes now to indicate that these are lexically stored forms. They're memorized. This voicing feature at the end of the morpheme is unpredictable and contrastive. And you can see that if you join these to another morpheme that's a vowel, in particular the schwa plural, they surface according to their underlying representations. What's interesting is that when they're not followed by a vowel, this one changes, it devoices, and so there must be an active constraint in German that says that voiced obstruents can't appear word finally. So when you pop this into a phonological word and it's not followed by a vowel, it will sometimes take on the allomorph mort. This is matching what we've already seen about the distribution of voicing contrasts in the German lexicon, but now we're able to use morphological alternations to show what would happen if a word final voiced obstruent did pop up in German. In particular, all of these words must be stored in the German lexicon with underlyingly voiced stops at the ends, all of these morphemes, and you can see that when you put them in a phonological context where German allows voiced obstruents. But if you take this plural vowel context away, all of a sudden the contrast neutralizes between voiceless and voiced stops, and you can see that this must be changing in this context. Now, this one has asymmetric information, this particular problem set. And one way of thinking about this is that based just on these words, you could either posit a rule or a constraint that takes voice stops and makes them voiceless at the ends of words, or a constraint or rule that takes voiceless stops and makes them voiced when they're maybe in between a sonorant and a vowel, or two vowels, or something like that. And either one of those analyses would work for these particular words. It's only when you look at the whole set that you find one of these doesn't work. In particular, if you have a rule that, say, changes a voiceless stop to voiced when it's in between a liquid and a schwa, for instance, you could get mort to turn into mod in this context, but it would fail for word, because you would predict if that rule is part of German, you should voice here as well. Instead, what we find is that voicing is fundamentally unpredictable in this pre-vocalic context. And so we know that whatever operation is changing the underlying lexical features in the underlying representation, it has to be targeting this context where things are phonologically predictable, and not this context where things are phonologically unpredictable. So you can't do a voicing process that will account for all the words in this German data set. Instead, you have to do a word final devoicing process, whether that's a rule or a constraint or what have you. So what we've gotten here is a lot of information about how German phonology works that we got just from looking at native vocabulary and how it does or doesn't change forms when you change the phonological context into which a morpheme is inserted. This relies on some pretty simple ideas, one of which is that every morpheme is stored in a single form in the lexicon. We don't have separate listings for mod and mort, because the difference between these two allomorphs is entirely phonologically predictable. Same thing for these two allomorphs, entirely phonologically predictable. So we posit only a single underlying form in the lexicon, and then we derive the surface allomorphs through general principles of German phonology. And what that means is that we can use these kinds of alternations to learn things about the phonology of a language. That's where we're headed next in this class.